Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the ITU Spectrum Management Training Program, a training program comprising all aspects of spectrum management, and we will handle in the first sessions the module number 1, the legal basis and the regulatory framework of spectrum management. Something about the organization of the work. The content of module 1 is spread over 4 weeks. The module in total comprises 12 presentations. And per week we will highlight 3 presentations in 1 lecture. During the week there will be a forum discussion and we have a chat session, and for both you are kindly invited to participate actively. The related material will be posted online, and also at the end of the week you will receive questions to see whether you have understood the material provided. At the end of week 4 you will receive a questionnaire, as ITU is curious to know how you found this way of training. So let us start with module 1, as said, the legal basis and the regulatory framework of spectrum management. And this module 1, ladies and gentlemen, is in fact the basis for all aspects of spectrum management. It covers the overall context and objectives and its practical realization in a complex multi-layered structure of international, regional and national levels. It includes the role and functions of the different stakeholders, the legal framework of underpinning all the interactions, and the role and operational principles of authorization processes, licensing of radio services. The objectives for week number 1 is to give you some information on the historical evolution of spectrum management leading to today's approach. We will talk about the role and structure of the ITU, and finally to the ITU radio communication sector, which brings us very close to spectrum management. So something about the ITU, founded in 1865 in Paris as the International Telegraph Union. In 1932 it took its present name, and in 1947, and very important, became a specialized agency of the United Nations. The first area of expertise was the telegraph, but ITU now covers the whole ICT sector, from digital broadcasting to the internet, and from mobile technologies to 3D TV. First a public-private partnership, but currently ITU has a membership of 193 countries and some 700 private sector entities. Its headquarters is in Geneva, and globally it has 12 regional and area offices. So it started all in 1844 with Mr. Morse, when he sends the first public message. About 10 years later, the service became available to the general public, and it was a restriction only to operate within national borders. As there was a rapid expansion, also in a growing number of countries, and that brought 20 European countries together to develop a framework agreement, as they saw the need for international interconnection. At the same time, the same group decided on common rules to standardize equipment to facilitate international interconnection, but also adopted operating instructions which would apply to all countries, and it all was laid down in common international tariff and accounting rules. So 1865 in Paris, after 2.5 months of negotiation, the first International Telegraph Convention was signed by the 20 founding members, and the International Telegraph Union, the ITU, was established. Today, about 150 years later, the reasons why which led to the establishment of the ITU still apply. As Mr. Marconi saw some advantages, he secured the British patent for wireless telegraphy, and he tried to monopolize the whole market by placing Marconists on board of ships, but also forbid them to communicate with any non-Marconi stations, and the idea was that primarily to keep information that might be relevant to stock markets, to keep that secret. And that brought and encouraged governments to convene the 1903 and 1906 Berlin conferences with the explicit aim of ending Mr. Marconi's monopoly. In fact, this led to an early version of the radio regulations, with clear guidelines for interoperability and interconnection. In 1906, we had the first International Radio Telegraph Conference in Berlin, and the delegates signed the first convention, and the annex to this convention contained the first regulations governing wireless telegraphy, and that, in fact, is what we know today as the radio regulations. Also, the development of software broadcasting was there in 1920, followed by the 1924 establishment of the International Telephone Consultative Committee, in 1925 the establishment of the International Telegraph Consultative Committee, and in 1927 by the establishment of the International Radio Consultative Committee, the CCIR. And the CCIR was made responsible for coordinating the technical studies, tests and measurements being carried out in various fields of telecommunications, but also for drawing up international standards. So, as said, we had the 1927 Radio Telegraphy Conference. It also allocated frequency bands to the various radio services in extent at the time for fixed, maritime and aeronautical mobile broadcasting, amateur and experimental use. In the 30s we had in 1932 the Madrid Conference, and the conference decided to combine the International Telegraph Convention of 1865 and the International Telegraph Convention of 1906 to form the International Telecommunication Convention. It was also decided to change the name of the union to International Telecommunication Union. The new name, which became effect on the 1st of January 1934, was chosen to properly reflect the full scope of the union's responsibilities, which by this time covered all forms of wireline and wireless communication. In the 1940s, we had in 1947 in Atlantic City the ITU conference with the aim of developing and modernizing the organization. In 1948, the headquarters were transferred from Bern to Geneva, and the establishment of the International Frequency Registration Board, the IFRB, to coordinate the increasingly complicated task of managing the radio frequency spectrum. The table of frequency allocations introduced in 1912 was declared mandatory. On the 15th November of 1947, an agreement between the ITU and the newly created United Nations was approved by the United Nations General Assembly and became applicable on a provisional basis from that date. The importance was that the agreement was recognizing the International Telecommunication Union as a UN specialized agency, formally entered into force on the 1st of January 1949. Something more, and later in development, we had the satellite era. In 1956, CCIT and CCIF were merged to form the International Telephone and Telegraph Consultative Committee. In 1957, we had the launch of the first artificial satellite, the Sputnik 1. And in 1963, the first geostationary communication satellite, SYNCOM-1, was put into orbit. And it was made by Mr. Clark in 1945 that he said satellites could be used for transmission of information. Something between the ITU and space. In 1959, the CCIR set up a study group responsible for studying space radio communication, and in 1963, an extraordinary administrative conference for space communications was held in Geneva, with the aim to allocate frequencies to the various space services. Into the 90s, we had in 92 allocations were made for the first time to serve the needs of a new kind of space servicing, the non-geostationary satellites, known as global mobile personal communications by satellite. And in 92 also the spectrum was identified, what was called IMT 2000. The ITU developed the next generation global standard for digital mobile telephony. To summarize, spectrum management started over 100 years ago, around 1904. Early management focused on ships, and then increasingly around the radio broadcast systems. Most of the legislation enabling regulation and licensing was put in place around the 30s, and the key change came in the 1960s when an economic approach to management was proposed, but it took about 20 years for it to actually be implemented. Also, auctions have become the standard way of assigning licenses, and other tools such as pricing and economic value assessment were widespread.